Hey there! Tonight, we're not going to royal courts or grand feasts. We're going somewhere quieter. Somewhere colder. And much harder to survive. A place you'd likely never want to visit, because if you did, you wouldn't last long. Tonight, we're returning to a medieval village. But not the romantic kind with quaint cottages and cheerful markets. No. This village is different. It's hungry. It's cold. It's ruled by fear and sickness and silence. It's a place carved out of dirt and desperation, barely holding on at the edge of history. A place where famine, plague, and power shaped every breath. This is not the part of the Middle Ages people like to remember. This is the part most people didn't survive. So if slow, honest history helps you drift off, feel free to settle in. Dim the lights. Let the hum of the fan be your backdrop. Let the world soften around the edges. And let's begin. Somewhere in a forgotten corner of the realm, no name, no landmark, just a shallow valley scraped clean by centuries of wind and want. You wouldn't find it on a map. Maps don't bother with places like this. No roads lead here. No songs are sung of it. But here is where most people lived. And died. It's early spring. But not the warm kind. The hungry kind. The kind where winter still clings to the soil, and the ground hasn't softened enough for new seed. You've been surviving on dried peas and thin porridge for weeks. The root cellar is nearly empty. The stew tastes like regret and boiled bark. The children are quieter than usual. They've learned to stay still when their stomachs ache. You've heard stories of other villages boiling leather to eat it. You wonder if that would work with your boots. The fields are bare. Last harvest was poor, too much rain, then not enough. The barley mold. The rye blackened with rot. A sickness followed the grain, turned stomach sour and skin pale. Old Margery didn't make it. Nor did 3 of the children. You buried them near the edge of the woods, where the soil is just loose enough to dig. And yet, worse is coming. You can feel it in the air. The steward from the manor will arrive soon. He'll ride in on a horse too clean for this place, ask how much grain you've stored, and write something in his ledger with ink you could never afford. You'll lie. You'll say you have enough. But he'll still take his share for the Lord, for the tax, for the kingdom. Because in the end, the king's hunger matters more than yours. You've never met the Lord who owns this land. But you know his presence. It lives in the calluses on your hands and the ache in your back. He is in the tithe you give, the bread you do not eat, the corners of your home that grow colder every winter. He is far away, but his power is not. And then, just as the frost starts to lift, the rumors begin again. Whispers carried from market towns by passing monks or wandering merchants. The plague. The Black Death. Back again. You've heard of it. You've seen what it does. You remember the last time, when people bled from strange places, when the priest stopped visiting homes, when the bell rang so often it broke. They say it travels fast, faster than horses, faster than prayers. Some say it's punishment from God. Others say it's the rats. You haven't seen many rats lately. Just as well. They eat what little you have. When the sickness comes, it won't knock. It'll seep in through the cracks. Through breath. Through touch. Through hope. And when it does, there will be nothing to stop it. The apothecary lives 3 villages over, and he's long since shut his door. You don't have coin for remedies anyway. No one here does. Some families will board up their homes and refuse to come out. Others will flee into the forest. You've thought about it. But the woods are no safer. Not with wolves, not with bandits. Not with whatever else might be watching from between the trees. You remember when the Reeve son tried to run last time? Said he'd rather take his chances beyond the hill than rot in a cottage full of coughs. They found him 2 weeks later. Or parts of him, anyway. And still, you stay. Not because you're brave. But because you're tired. Because this is your home. Because this is the only place that knows your name. Because someone has to care for the goats. For the children. For the patch of soil that might, just might, grow something if the rains come right this year. You sit by the hearth, such as it is. The fire barely warms the room, but it keeps the worst of the damp away. Smoke curls up through a hole in the roof and settles into the thatch, where it will linger for years. You can taste it when you sleep. There are no chimneys. No windows. Just slits in the wall to let the light in and the stench out. You share this one room with 6 other people and 2 chickens. The cow used to sleep inside too, but she died last winter. Fell in the mud and never got back up. You cried harder for her than you did for some of the neighbors. Outside, the wind picks up. It always sounds like someone whispering your name. The door rattles on its wooden peg. The shutters flap. You'll fix them in the morning. Or you won't. There's always something more urgent. Like not dying. And still, somehow, the days pass. Slow. Relentless. The rhythm of survival becomes its own kind of prayer. Gather wood. Tend fire. Fetch water. Stir pot. Chase chicken. Repeat. Each breath is an act of defiance. Each day is a small victory against the weight of centuries trying to press you back into the earth. And yet, you wonder, what would it be like to live without fear? Without pain? Without the constant knowing that you are disposable. You've heard stories of places with clean water, with bread every day, with no lords, no plagues. Cities. Maybe across the sea. Maybe in heaven. Maybe not real at all. Still, you dream. Not in grand visions. But in flickers. A warm bed. A full belly. A quiet evening without dread scratching at the door. You hold tight to these small dreams. Because hope, even here, is harder to kill than rats or crops or peasants. The plague will come again. The steward will return. The winter will be worse. The hunger deeper. The losses heavier. And yet, you will wake up tomorrow. You will stand. You will shovel mud. You will fix the roof with straw that leaks anyway. You will bury what must be buried. And you will keep going. Because that's what peasants do. Not for glory. Not for legacy. But because there is no other choice. And somehow, in the quiet persistence of your breath and footsteps, you have built something that the lords and kings never could, a life carved out of dust and fire and grief. And that is enough. For tonight. For now. So sleep well, quiet traveler. The world was never kind. But for a moment, you endured it anyway. Their days were governed not just by the rising and setting sun, but by the will of the Lord who owned the land upon which they toiled. This Lord, the feudal master of the manor, was often a figure distant yet ever present in the lives of the peasants. His power was absolute within his domain, and his word was law. Not all lords were cruel, but many were harsh and indifferent. To them, the peasants were less individuals than they were tools, tools that planted, harvested, built, and bled. The taxes were steep, the demands unyielding. A peasant might surrender a significant portion of his grain to the Lord, leaving his own family with barely enough to survive the winter. In some manors, the Lord steward enforced these duties with iron severity. If a man failed to meet his quota, he might face punishment, a fine, a public rebuke, or worse, a beating administered before the village. A common saying among peasants was that God watches the soul, but the Lord owns the flesh. For many, the nobleman's manor was as immovable and intimidating as a mountain, and as merciless in its hunger for rent, labor, and obedience. Worse still, during years of poor harvest or famine, when the earth gave little and the sky remained pitilessly dry, the peasant still had to pay. He could not plead hunger. The granaries of the Lord must be filled, regardless of whether the peasant's own cupboard was bare. And so they endured. But there were greater miseries yet to come, miseries that even the most powerful lords could not command nor contain. Around the mid-14th century, a shadow fell over Europe. It crept in quietly at first, through ports and along the trade roads. Carried by merchant ships, borne upon the backs of rats and the bite of fleas, came death. Sudden, indiscriminate, and merciless. The people called it many names. The Great Mortality. The Pestilence. But history would remember it simply as the Black Death. It struck without warning. A man might wake in the morning feeling well enough to plough his fields, and by nightfall he would be feverish and near death. Painful swellings, blackened sores, and bleeding from within. Some died within hours. Others lingered in agony for days. Villages emptied almost overnight. Whole families perished in their huts. Fields went untended. Cattle wandered the roads without owners. Priests gave last rites until they too collapsed. And the bells, always the bells, ringing ceaselessly for the dead, so many that bell ringers themselves began to fall. In some regions, as many as 1 in every 2 people died. The lords, once so proud and powerful, found themselves helpless. Their gold could not buy safety. Their swords could not cut through plague. Castles locked their gates, but still the sickness crept in. In the countryside, peasants buried their own dead in shallow pits. Some villages were so thoroughly wiped out that no one remained to toll the death knell. Panic spread faster than the disease. Some believed it was God's punishment for sin. Others blamed outsiders or the poor. Flagellants wandered the land, whipping themselves in repentance. Superstition flourished like mold upon bread. Yet even as the world seemed to crumble, some endured. The plough returned to the furrows. Children were born to fill the empty homes. Nature healed, in time. And the survivors, thinner, quieter, and deeply changed, returned to the life they had always known, tending animals, sowing seeds, watching the sky. The plague had left a scar upon the soul of Europe. But the peasants' work remained. And so did the seasons, steady and patient. The wheel of life turned on. Even under the yoke of cruel lords and the shadow of disease, the humble peasant rose with the dawn, and worked. Until the sun sank low once more. And the world was silent again. just the sound of the wind through thatched roofs, and the creak of the old wooden plough. And then sleep. Deep, dreamless sleep. Until the cock crowed once more, and the day began anew. And yet, despite all that they endured, despite the hunger in harsh winters, the lashes of unkind lords, and the quiet terror that sickness might descend again without warning, the peasant did not stop. There was no room to stop. There was grain to thresh, sheep to shear, and children to raise. Life moved not in dramatic turns, but in slow repetitions. The smell of wet earth after rain, the ache in the back after bending over the fields all day, the small comfort of warm bread shared by the fire. These were the constants. The things one could count on. The manor bell still rang out for work and worship, for curfews and councils, even if fewer voices answered than before. In the stillness that followed the great pestilence, strange things began to happen. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Some peasants found, for the first time, that their toil had value. That they could bargain, quietly, cautiously, for better terms. That a neighboring manor, also desperate for hands to till its soil, might offer slightly more generous conditions. Nothing changed overnight, but seeds were sown. Seeds not of barley or oats, but of possibility. Even so, for most, life returned to its old patterns. The seasons rotated faithfully. Lent came. Then Easter. Then the harvest festivals in late summer. The church calendar moved like the sky, indifferent and ever-present. The fields grew thick with wheat once again. Children learned their fathers' plough paths. Girls learned to spin and bake, boys to thatch and herd. Elders told stories of the old days, of the great sickness, of the cruel lords, of the wolves that howled at the village edge one terrible winter long ago, and the young listened, wide-eyed, as if hearing myths. But these were not myths. They were memories. Simple, grim, enduring memories. And when night fell, it fell slowly, as it always had. The firelight flickered against the mud walls of the hut. The animals settled in their pens. And the world grew quiet. Only the wind stirred through the straw roofs. A dog barked once, then went silent. Somewhere, a cradle creaked gently. And under woolen blankets, rough but warm, the villagers slept. Not deeply, perhaps. Not safely. But with a kind of peace born from exhaustion and habit. Tomorrow, the sun would rise again. And the work would begin once more. As it always had. As it always would. And so the seasons passed, and with them came not only the burdens of toil but also the spectre of suffering that no plough or prayer could fend off. In the year of our Lord 1348, a great and terrible shadow fell across the land, a sickness so sudden, so devastating, that it seemed the heavens themselves had grown weary of man's ceaseless toiling. The pestilence began as a whisper from distant lands, tales carried by merchants and travelers of a deadly affliction that crept from the east like a stalking wolf. It came by ship, by cart, by foot, unseen but unstoppable, and when it arrived, it did not knock gently. The Black Death, as it would later be known, was a scourge unlike any the peasants had seen. It began with a fever, a cough, then swellings in the armpits and groin, black, oozing buboes that pulsed with pain. The afflicted often died within days, some within hours, their bodies crumpled on the dirt floors of their cottages, or discarded in ditches when room in the churchyard ran out. Whole families vanished. Fields went untilled. Bread remained unbaked. The very air seemed to thrum with dread. Those who remained tried desperately to understand. Was it God's punishment for sin? Was it the devil's work? Or the result of poisoned wells, as some claimed in whispers? But understanding did little to protect them. In the village of Elderthorn, Father Bertram, the aging priest who had baptized, wed, and buried so many, began to lose count. His sermons grew quieter. He no longer rang the church bell himself, for his apprentice had died coughing blood upon the altar. The pews emptied as the villagers prayed from their doorways, fearful of the contagion that seemed to linger in every breath. But amidst this desolation, life is stubborn, weary life, continued. The crops had to be planted. The animals fed. And while death prowled like a wolf in the mist, there were mouths that still needed feeding, and arms that must swing the scythe or cradle the infant. When the plague finally receded, it left behind not peace, but silence, a haunted kind of quietude, as though the very earth was mourning. Villages that once echoed with laughter and labor stood hollow. Fields overgrown with thistle bore witness to the absence of hands that once tilled them. Yet in the wake of such horror, something curious happened. With fewer peasants remaining, the value of their labor began to rise. The surviving workers, hardened by grief and scarcity, began to demand more grain, more coin, more freedom. The lords, weakened by loss and desperate to see their manors function again, were forced in some cases to agree. Not all lords, however, were willing to bend. In the north, beyond the rivers and hills, ruled Lord Gregor of Ashvale, a nobleman whose reputation for cruelty was whispered among peasants like the legend of a vengeful ghost. Lord Gregor, a tall and gaunt man with a voice like frost on stone, ruled not by wisdom but by fear. His manor sat high on a cliffside, its grey towers perpetually shrouded in mist, as if the very weather obeyed his cruel disposition. When the plague had come, he did not offer aid to the villagers. He closed the gates of his estate, posted armed guards, and let the peasantry die outside the walls. When it passed, he emerged untouched and unrepentant. To the survivors, he offered no thanks or comfort, only higher taxes and harsher laws. Any who refused his demands were punished severely. One miller, a widowed man who had dared to question the new tithe, was hanged from the village gallows and left as a warning, his body swaying for weeks as the crows gathered. And yet, even in Ashvale, resistance stirred. Among the survivors was a young peasant named Rowan, whose family had been lost to the pestilence. Strong of arm and quiet of voice, Rowan began to speak to others, not loudly, not incautiously, but in the fields, under the moonlight, behind barn doors. He spoke of justice, of worth, of the truth that the land did not belong to the Lord, but to those who made it live. These thoughts were dangerous, treasonous even, but the ground had been made fertile by despair. What grew now was not wheat, but defiance. Tales like Rowan's were not unique. Across the kingdom, in the wake of plague and tyranny, common folk began to find their voice. Rebellions brewed slowly, like storm clouds over fallow fields. Some were small, snuffed out before the first torch was lit. Others became full uprisings, such as the Great Revolt of 1381, when peasants from Kent and Essex marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom, to cruel taxation, and to the false promises of lords. But that is a tale for another hour. For now, dear listener, let us return once more to the quieter days, when the Black Death had passed, when fields once more bore grain, and the bells once again tolled for weddings rather than wakes. The peasants, though scarred by plague and tyranny, resumed their rhythm, slow, steady, and strong. The morning still began with the crow of roosters and the prayer whispered over rough bread. The days still passed with aching backs and muddy boots. and the night still brought stars overhead, and stories whispered beside the hearth. Even in a world of lords and pestilence, of hunger and hangings, the simple act of surviving, of planting, of birthing, of loving, was an act of quiet defiance. And in that, the peasants endured. As the wheel of time turned, their story, forgotten by many, remembered by few, continued, nestled in the furrows of history. Now, rest easy, dear soul. Let the echoes of hooves and harvest fade gently into silence. For the tale is long, but the night is gentle. Let the past cradle your dreams, and sleep, like the soil, settle soft and deep. And so, the years rolled onward, as years always do, quiet and unrelenting. The scars left by the plague did not disappear, they faded, like old ink on parchment, but never truly vanished. Villages slowly refilled with life, not always with those who had once called them home, but with newcomers, wanderers, and the occasional runaway serf who dared to seek a better life under a different name. The old ways persisted, as stubborn as the ivy on the manor walls. The three-field system endured, with rotation and rhythm guiding the hands of laborers who measured time not by clocks, but by seasons. Sheep grazed where men had once fought. Newborns were christened in the same stone churches where the echoes of plague-time mourning still lingered. The land remembered. But while some lords bent with the changing times, adjusting rents and easing burdens, others tightened their grip with iron resolve. Lord Gregor of Ashvale remained one of the harshest. Having survived the pestilence untouched, he believed himself chosen by God, or at the very least, sanctioned by fate to dominate those beneath him. His punishments grew more inventive, his taxes more exacting. He demanded that peasants repair the manor roads with their bare hands, often in winter when frost cracked the earth and turned stone to glass. It was said, in hushed voices and trembling tones, that he kept a ledger thicker than a Bible, wherein he recorded every infraction, no matter how small. A stolen egg. A missed church service. A glance held too long. His steward, a man named Halric, enforced these laws with zeal, his leather boots soaked often in the mud of ruined gardens and once, rumor claimed, in blood. Still, the villagers endured, because they had to. Because they had no choice. And yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted. Where once the villagers had bowed their heads and mumbled apologies, now their silences carried a weight, a tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Children grew up with stories of what had been lost, not only to plague, but to cruelty. Some whispered of rebellion. Others made pacts in shadows, sharpening sickles not only for harvest. One year, a terrible drought struck Ashvale. The fields cracked and split. The wheat failed. Even the barley withered. Lord Gregor, unmoved by pleas, increased his demands, insisting the villagers make up for the lost yield with labor. He claimed his own stores of grain must be protected for the winter, guarded day and night. And so, starving, some peasants began to sneak into his granaries. They were caught. For men and one girl, no more than 16, were lashed in the village square. The girl died the next morning, her wounds festering. Her name was Annas. And her death became a quiet spark. Rowan, now a man grown strong and weary, stood at the edge of that crowd as the girl's body was lowered into the earth. He said nothing. But that night, when the village gathered behind locked doors, it was he who spoke first. He did not shout. He simply told them the truth, that Lord Gregor had broken the covenant between ruler and ruled. That they were no longer bound to obey a master who treated them as beasts. that even the lowest plowman was made of flesh, of thought, of soul. The people listened. They did not rise that night, nor the next. But seeds had been planted, not in soil, but in spirit. That winter, Lord Gregor's barn burned. No one claimed responsibility. In the spring, one of his tax collectors disappeared on the road between villages. His horse returned alone. There were rumors, of course, but no arrests. Life in Ashvale became tense, brittle. The steward patrolled with twice the usual guards. Curfews were imposed. Meetings forbidden. And still, the fields needed sowing. Still, babies were born. Still, songs were hummed over cradles and in corners. In time, these quiet acts of defiance grew bolder. One morning, the Lord's banners were found torn and trampled in the churchyard. A scythe was left leaning against the pulpit. Another morning, the manor well had been salted, the water rendered useless. None confessed. All remained silent. And then, one dusky summer evening, Lord Gregor's gates were breached. Not by an army, not with swords and fire, but by the people of Ashvale, with tools, torches, fists, and fury that had fermented over years. The manor guards, few and underpaid, fled. Gregor, once so proud and feared, was dragged from his hall and forced to face the very peasants he had starved. What happened next is told in many ways. Some say Rowan gave a speech. Others say no words were spoken at all. A few claim the Lord was spared, exiled to wander the earth in rags. Most say he was thrown into his own granary and left to burn with the season's harvest. No one agrees. No one dares speak of it openly. But the manor was never rebuilt. And from that day on, Ashvale was ruled not by a lord, but by its people. Their freedom was fragile, contested, and dangerous. The crown would not look kindly on self-rule. Other lords whispered of revenge. But for a while, for a precious season, the people of Ashvale planted, harvested, and shared their bread as equals. Even in such grim centuries, even in a world of plague, famine, and lash, there were moments, flickers, of justice, of dignity reclaimed. And as the stars returned to their nightly place above the fields, and the wind carried the scent of rye and rain, the story of the peasants went on. Not written in books or sung by bards, but kept in the quiet memory of the earth, and in the blood of those who refused to kneel. And so the years rolled on, and the waning days of the 14th century gave way to the dawning light of the 15th. The world was not as it had been, though many who toiled the earth scarcely knew how much it had changed. The villages remained quiet, the fields remained faithful, and the sky still gave its measure of rain and shine. Yet, beneath the surface of daily life, tremors stirred, a growing restlessness in the land, and in the hearts of men. In the manors and strongholds of the nobility, power played its intricate game. A new breed of lord had risen, hardened not only by war but by cruelty, and the insatiable need to dominate. Some among them, once mere custodians of royal favor, became iron-fisted rulers of their fiefs, wielding justice not with a balanced scale, but with the lash and the gallows. These lords were not satisfied with service, they demanded submission. Their hallways echoed not with music, but with the cries of prisoners chained in dungeons below. In many such domains, the peasants trembled more at the sight of their lord's horse than at the storm clouds overhead. A misstep could bring more than scorn, it might mean a whipping post in the village square, or worse, disappearance into the night, never to be seen again. Taxes grew crueler still, not for the crown or the church, but for the vanity of a lord building a second keep, or adorning his wife's gowns with gold thread and pearls. In these places, the manor house was no longer a symbol of protection, but a fortress of fear. And yet, still, the fields had to be tilled. Still, the cows needed milking, and the wheat needed reaping. For all the horror that lived behind high stone walls, life in the cottages went on, slow, plodding, cyclical. One foot in front of the other. One season turning into the next. But the land was not merely troubled by men. Nature, too, dealt its cruel hand. Disease, which had never truly left since the Black Death, returned in brutal waves. In some places, it was a cough that rattled the lungs, then a fever, and finally silence. In others, it was the telltale swelling, the blackened sores, and the stench of decay that signaled a plague's return. People whispered of God's wrath, of devils walking amongst them, of witches in the woods. In cities, the dead piled high in carts, and the bell of the church tolled endlessly. But even in the countryside, where homes were scattered and distant, the plague found its way. Sometimes it came with a traveling merchant. Sometimes with a soldier returned from war. Sometimes, it seemed, the disease rode on the wind itself. Whole families vanished. Villages were abandoned, roofs sagging under the weight of silence. Fields grew wild, orchards went unpicked, and roads disappeared beneath grass and moss. Those who survived often did so with fear carved deep into their souls. Children no longer played freely near the forest's edge. Women crossed themselves at every shadow. And old men spoke less of saints and more of ghosts. But hardship has a way of forging resilience, too. In the absence of help from above, peasants turned to one another. They shared bread, bartered cloth, watched each other's children, and buried the dead with shaking hands. In the worst-hit areas, the old feudal bonds broke completely. Some serfs simply walked away, into the forests or to other villages, never to return. Others stayed, bound not by duty, but by habit, and by love of the land. Through all this, a strange kind of change was beginning to take root, like moss between the stones. The great lords, for all their might, found it harder to command when their labor force had vanished. Some tried to enforce old laws, to shackle freedom with fines and fear. But others, desperate to keep their fields from going fallow, began offering wages to those who would return. The age of the free laborer was dawning, quietly and without fanfare, born of devastation and necessity. And while the nobles schemed and the peasants endured, the church, once the bedrock of all things, found its authority questioned in a way not seen for centuries. The plagues, the wars, the endless suffering, they had promised salvation, but delivered little comfort. In corners of Europe, new voices began to whisper. Scholars and preachers, often hunted, sometimes burned, asked whether God required gold and obedience, or merely humility and truth. These thoughts, dangerous though they were, reached the countryside like distant thunder. Few peasants could read, but news came all the same, through traveling friars, gossip at markets, or the tales of a miller's cousin who had gone to the city and returned changed. Ideas, like illness, are contagious. And though slowly, the old certainties began to crumble. The 15th century, though shrouded in the mist of time, bore witness to the birth pangs of a new world. It was not yet the Renaissance. It was not yet the age of reason. But the ground beneath the plough was shifting. The peasant, once barely more than a beast of burden, was beginning to understand his own worth, not as property, but as a man. Still, for many, life continued much as it always had. In a stone cottage warmed by a single hearth, an old woman spun wool beside a window smeared with breath. A boy fetched water from a frozen stream, his hands red from cold. In the distance, a shepherd called to his dog as fog rolled over the hills. And somewhere, a bell tolled, not for death, but for vespers, calling the faithful to prayer. Yes, the century would bring fire, and blood, and fear. But it would also bring quiet courage, the seed of change, and the enduring strength of those whose names were never written in books. The peasants, the mothers, the shepherds, and the smiths, the ones who bore the weight of the world not in fame, but in silence. And the fields, as always, endured. Brown in winter, green in spring, golden in harvest, sleeping under snow, then stirring once more. The 15th century wore on, dragging with it both splendor and suffering. Beneath the eaves of the thick forests and crumbling keeps, life in the countryside began to change, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a distant storm gathering behind hills still sunlit. Though the rhythms of sowing and harvest still dictated the lives of most peasants, new forces began to stir beneath the surface. The great feudal lords, those aging lions of old battles and ancient bloodlines, found their grip loosening. War, pestilence, and ambition worked together to tear the tapestry of tradition apart. Among the most notorious of these lords was Baron Aldrich of Westmere, a cruel and cunning noble whose keep loomed high above the village of Edderwick. His ancestors had once been praised for their justice, but Aldrich was a man of different cloth. His levies were harsh, his punishments unmerciful. In his pursuit of wealth and legacy, he would extort not just coin from his subjects, but their very sense of safety. It was whispered that he hung a man for letting his sheep graze too close to the woods, and burned a widow's cottage because she could not offer more than 2 eggs as tax. Villagers would murmur prayers before crossing under the shadow of his battlements, and children were taught to lower their voices near the road that wound up to his hall, lest their play provoke his ire. Yet as Aldrich's power grew, so too did the forces that would one day unravel him. Trade routes expanded, bringing new goods and new ideas. Merchants from far-off Flanders and Venice arrived with bolts of wool and tales of towns where guilds governed, not lords. In cities, the merchant class swelled. Some peasants fled the manors, risking outlawry to seek lives in the burgeoning urban sprawl. And in those darkened alleyways of York and London, a different kind of unrest brewed. Laborious, tired of starvation wages, began to whisper of rights, of dignity. The embers of rebellion, once scattered, began to glow. Still, the countryside reeled from other blows. The plague returned, not with the same ferocity as the Black Death, but with cruel precision. In 1463, a fresh wave of sweating sickness swept through the Midlands. It struck suddenly, a fever that overwhelmed in hours. People fell in the fields, in their beds, in church pews. In the village of Branscombe, nearly half the population perished within a week. Bells tolled ceaselessly, their mournful sound a dirge to the lost. With death came famine, as fields lay unharvested and granaries empty. In some places, wolves were seen again at the edge of villages, drawn by the scent of decay. The church, once a pillar of comfort, now faced suspicion. Some priests fled their parishes, others preached that the plagues were punishments for hidden sin. Flagellants roamed the roads again, their backs blooded by scourges, chanting apocalyptic hymns as they passed through broken hamlets. Heretical sects emerged, some claiming that all men should own land, that no priest could forgive sins, that the kingdom of God must be built not with stone but with justice. Such beliefs were dangerous. The Inquisition's long fingers reached even into the English countryside, and bonfires lit the dusk in more than one sleepy shire. Amidst this turbulence, life for the average peasant remained a quiet endurance. They bound themselves more to one another, forming tighter kinships, sharing loaves when there was too little, sheltering one another from the cold and from the gaze of soldiers. In places where lords had died without heirs, communities sometimes managed their own affairs. A reeve elected by consensus might settle disputes, while a village priest helped with written records. These experiments in self-rule were fragile, often crushed by the return of a claimant noble or a royal decree, but they lingered, like seeds blown under stone, waiting. One such village was Homer Green. Nestled between marsh and wood, its isolation had long been a curse, cut off from markets, vulnerable to bandits. But during the plague years, it became a haven. Refugees arrived, and the old manor fell empty when the lord and his son succumbed to illness. The villagers, led by a wise woman named Annis and a blacksmith called Raedwald, created a council. They kept peace, divided labor, even built a school for children. For a decade, Homer Green thrived in anonymity, a quiet experiment in communal life beneath the gaze of no crown or crozier. But peace rarely endures unchallenged. When a distant cousin of the dead lord laid claim to the land, soldiers came. The villagers resisted, not with swords, for they had none, but with barricades and petitions. They sent word to sympathetic townsfolk and friars who had once seen their community. A standoff began. The soldiers camped outside the village for weeks, hesitant to provoke bloodshed. In the end, it was the winter that resolved the matter. The river flooded, cutting off supply lines, and the would-be claimant retreated, grumbling, back to the city. These stories, scattered and often forgotten, speak of a changing world. The late Middle Ages were not just an age of knights and kings, but of struggle, adaptation, and quiet defiance. And still, through it all, the seasons turned. The frost came in November, laying white breath over the thatch. Lambs were born in spring, their bleats rising into the warming air. The wheel of time ground onward, and in its motion, the seeds of a new era of reformation, exploration, and revolution were silently sown. As the 15th century drew toward its twilight, the world that had once seemed eternal, of lords in stone halls, of peasants bending beneath the sun, of sermons and seasons and unchanging order, began to fracture in quiet but undeniable ways. In the courts of kings, letters were now written more frequently in English than in Latin or French. The nobility, once armored warlords of the countryside, now sought favor in courtly intrigue and distant diplomacy. But it was in the villages, among the hedgerows and crooked lanes, that the most profound, if least noticed, transformation slowly unfurled. In the shadow of the changing world, a child named Elric was born in the village of Dunwell, near the River Ouse. His mother, Hilda, was a weaver, known for her skill with flax, and his father, Garin, a tenant farmer on lands leased from a minor baron who seldom visited. Elric's childhood was neither harsh nor easy, shaped by chores, local festivals, and long winter evenings around the hearth. He learned to read from a kindly old priest named Father Ambrose, who believed that books should not belong solely to the clergy. Under Ambrose's guidance, Elric discovered the Psalms, the herbal lore of Hildegard of Bingen, and even a few works of ancient Roman thought smuggled in from scholars in Cambridge. But Elric's world, like so many others, was touched by the tremors of distant powers. In 1485, the dynastic struggle known as the Wars of the Roses finally reached its bloody conclusion at Bosworth Field. King Richard III was slain, and Henry Tudor rose as Henry VII, founding a new royal house. The battle itself was far removed from Dunwell, yet its aftermath brought changes that trickled slowly into village life. Taxation increased to rebuild the royal treasury. A census was taken. New magistrates appointed by the crown replaced some of the old, hereditary lords. The villagers of Dunwell soon found themselves answering not to a dusty baron, but to a royal sheriff who wore velvet and carried scrolls bearing the king's seal. Meanwhile, the rhythm of the seasons remained. Elric grew. He learned the cycle of sowing barley in March, of watching for the May frosts, of reaping in late July with sweat on his brow and straw in his shirt. He grew tall and strong, and like many, he dreamed of something more. It was a time when the world seemed to be opening. In the towns, printers had begun to appear, setting movable type and multiplying books in a matter of days. The tales of faraway lands, of Constantinople fallen, of new routes to Cathay, of great ships with billowing sails, filtered into village alehouses with the return of wandering jouglots and ex-soldiers. In 1492, news spread of a Genoese sailor who had sailed west from Spain and claimed to have reached new islands. The story sounded mad, impossible. Some said he had fallen off the edge of the world and returned with his mind shattered. Others whispered of gold, strange fruits, and dark-skinned peoples dressed in feathers. In Dunwell, the tale was heard with a mix of awe and skepticism. Elric listened, wide-eyed, wondering what lay beyond the horizon he had never crossed. At the same time, the winds of religion began to stir restlessly. Though Martin Luther would not hammer his theses to the church door until the next decade, murmurs of dissatisfaction were already rising. People questioned why indulgences were sold, why the Latin Mass could not be spoken in the common tongue, why bishops lived in luxury while peasants starved. Father Ambrose continued to preach gently, but he no longer chided those who asked uncomfortable questions. He even began to translate small passages of scripture into English for his flock, a quiet act of defiance. By the turn of the century, Elric was a man of 30, with calloused hands and thoughtful eyes. He married a woman named Lena, a strong-willed daughter of a miller, and together they began to raise a family in a cottage near the Elm Grove. Their lives were modest, made of bread and broth, of laughter under the stars and sorrow when a child fell ill. But they were also lives touched by the quiet progress of a changing world. Elric taught his children to read, using worn pages salvaged from a discarded psalter. Lena joined with other village women to demand fairer weights at the Lord's granary, citing laws once unknown to them but now copied and passed from town to town. Farther afield, change swept faster. The enclosure movement, which saw common lands fenced off and converted to private pasture, began to reach their region. Where once villagers had grazed sheep and gathered firewood freely, they now found hedges and signs proclaiming the land forbidden. Tensions rose. Some villagers, desperate, pulled down fences by night. Others fled to the cities, swelling the ranks of the poor and landless in places like Norwich and Bristol. Beggars multiplied. So too did thieves and wandering bands of former soldiers turned mercenaries or outlaws. In response, the laws hardened. A new Vagrancy Act declared that those without work or home could be whipped, branded, or imprisoned. The age-old distinction between the settled and the rootless grew sharper. But even among hardship, there were moments of wonder. Traveling players came through Dunwell, performing tales of ancient Troy and the misadventures of Robin Hood. A new cartographer passed through, bearing maps that showed not just the English coast, but strange new lands beyond the sea, labeled with names like Hispaniola and Terra Nova. And still, as always, the seasons turned. Snow fell on the fields in January, and children carved shapes into the frost. bees buzzed in June, and the wheat turned golden. Elric, now greying, stood often in the doorway of his home, watching the sky. He had never seen a ship or crossed a border, yet his life had touched empires, kings, and oceans through the quiet revolution of literacy, trade, and faith. It was a world in flux, neither medieval nor fully modern, filled with contradiction and potential. The last embers of feudalism still glowed in the manor courts, even as coins replaced tithes and contract replaced oath. The church still held power, but its authority began to waver beneath the weight of printing presses and protest. The people, long bound to the soil, now stirred restlessly, sensing that they stood at the edge of something vast and uncertain. And so, the age of the peasant as the cornerstone of rural life, though not ended, began to fade. Their story, often unwritten, whispered from mother to daughter, father to son, would pass into the next era, not with fanfare, but with the quiet dignity of those who endured. As the 15th century continued to unfold, a deep unease began to settle like an unspoken storm over the fields of England. The rhythms of life, once predictable and secure, began to show cracks. The peasants, who had long accepted the heavy yoke of feudal obligations, began to shift uneasily under its weight. The laws that bound them to the land, that kept them tethered to their lords and masters, were suddenly questioned in whispers at tavern tables, in the corners of barns, and during the long, sleepless nights by the hearth. They had seen the lords grow richer, their lands expanding, while their own pockets remained empty and their families faced hunger in years of bad harvests. It was in this climate of discontent that unrest began to stir in the villages, a quiet but increasingly desperate murmur that would soon boil over into open revolt. The peasants, living in the shadow of their feudal lords, had long endured harsh conditions, the crushing weight of taxes, the demands for forced labor, and the endless tolls they paid to work the land they called their own. But when news spread of a new edict from the crown, one that tightened the laws around land ownership, increasing rents and further restricting access to common lands, the tension finally snapped. It was during the bitter winter of 1493, when the cold seemed to slice through the very bones of the villagers, that the first sparks of rebellion ignited. In the village of Dunwell, where Elric and his family lived, the seeds of protest had been quietly sown. The sheriff, a man named Walter Drayton, had arrived in the village with a new set of demands from the lord of the manor. Rents were to be increased, and fines for land use would be enforced more strictly than ever before. The villagers, already struggling to feed themselves through the harsh winter months, found themselves caught between the crushing weight of feudal obligations and the barest scraps of survival. It was Elric who first spoke out at the village meeting, his voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of hardship. He spoke of fairness, of justice, of the years spent under the thumb of their lord, with nothing to show for it but the weariness of endless toil. "We are the ones who till the soil," Elric said, his voice steady and calm. "We are the ones who make this land fruitful. And yet, we are the ones who suffer the most." The villagers, weary and hungry, looked to him with a mixture of hope and fear. They had heard rumors of uprisings in other parts of the kingdom, of peasant revolts that had been ruthlessly crushed by the king's soldiers. Yet there was something in Elric's words that stirred their spirits. In that moment, they knew that they were not alone. They were not the only ones to suffer. And perhaps, just perhaps, they could stand together against the injustice that had plagued them for so long. Elric's words spread like wildfire across the village, and soon, other villages in the region began to stir as well. The sheriff's demands were met with defiance, and the peasants began to refuse the increasing rents and taxes. They held meetings in secret, gathered under the cover of darkness to discuss their plight, to plan their next move. The local clergy, though often bound to the landowners, began to offer quiet support to the movement, speaking of justice and equality in their sermons. The land was the people's, they said, and it was their right to live in peace and security. As the spring thawed the earth in 1494, tensions reached a boiling point. The sheriff returned to Dunwell, bringing with him soldiers and a message from the lord of the manor: the peasants must pay or face punishment. This time, the villagers did not cower. Instead, they stood together, defiant. Armed with little more than farming tools, they confronted the soldiers in the village square. It was not the first time that a peasant revolt had been sparked, but it was perhaps the first time that a village had risen up so fiercely in the face of overwhelming odds. The confrontation was brutal. The soldiers, accustomed to the obedience of the common folk, were caught off guard by the strength of the peasants' resolve. In the end, the villagers managed to drive the soldiers out of their village, sending a message that would echo across the land. The rebellion spread quickly, igniting a fire of resistance that could not be easily extinguished. The villagers of Dunwell were no longer just a collection of weary peasants, they were a symbol of something much larger, a movement for justice that was beginning to ripple across the countryside. Word of the rebellion reached the ears of the lords, and they responded with swift and brutal force. Armies were raised, and soldiers were sent to crush the growing insurrection. In Dunwell, the villagers prepared for a siege, barricading themselves within the walls of their homes. Elric, now a leader of the resistance, gathered the men of the village and trained them in the rudimentary tactics of defense. They did not have swords or armor, but they had the land, and they knew it better than anyone. The days stretched on, and the soldiers began to close in on Dunwell. The villagers held out, but the situation grew increasingly desperate. The once familiar landscape of fields and woods became a battleground, a place where every tree, every stone, was both a refuge and a potential hiding spot for enemy soldiers. The villagers fought with a fierce determination, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Still, they refused to surrender. It was in the final days of the siege that Elric made a desperate decision. With the villagers cornered and the soldiers closing in, he sent a small group of men to the nearby town of Aylesbury, hoping to find reinforcements from other villages who had also been suffering under the weight of feudal oppression. It was a long shot, but it was their only hope. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty and fear. The villagers held their ground, but the weight of their isolation began to tell. It seemed as though the cause for which they had fought so hard was slipping through their fingers. And yet, in the darkest hours of the siege, when all hope seemed lost, the reinforcements arrived. The soldiers who had been sent to crush the rebellion were overwhelmed by the unexpected arrival of a large group of peasants from neighboring villages, who had heard the call for help and had answered. The tide of the battle shifted, and the Lord's forces were forced to retreat. For the first time in many years, the peasants had won a battle. But it was not just a victory for Dunwell, it was a victory for all those who had suffered under the yoke of feudalism. The rebellion did not end the rule of the lords, but it sent a message that would echo through the centuries. It was a message that reminded those in power that the people had a voice, and that, when pushed to the edge, they could rise up and demand their dignity. It was a moment of change, a small but significant turning point in the history of the land. As the summer of 1494 drew to a close, the village of Dunwell slowly began to rebuild. The rebellion had brought both triumph and loss, but the spirit of resistance remained strong. Elric, now a leader of his people, continued to fight for justice, for the rights of the common folk. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, the villagers knew that they had shown their strength. They had stood up, and for the first time in generations, they had made their voices heard. But the echoes of their struggle would not fade so easily. Across the land, the seeds of resistance had been planted, and though it would take many years for them to fully bloom, the fires of change had been lit. The feudal system, with its harsh taxes and oppressive lords, could no longer go unchallenged. The peasants, once voiceless and oppressed, had begun to speak out, and in time, the world would listen. As autumn arrived in 1494, the villagers of Dunwell were still recovering from the fierce battle they had fought in the summer. Their homes, once sturdy, were now scarred by the marks of war. Yet the spirit of the people remained unbroken. What had started as a quiet whisper of dissent had turned into a full-fledged movement, a movement for justice, for dignity, for the rights of the common folk. Though the rebellion in Dunwell had been a small spark, it had spread far beyond the boundaries of the village. The peasants of neighboring towns had taken notice, and word of the victory against the Lord's soldiers had inspired others to speak out against the feudal system. In the villages of the surrounding region, the mood had shifted. The once passive acceptance of the Lord's demands had been replaced by a growing resistance. The peasants were no longer content to toil in silence, they now demanded a share of the wealth that the land produced. They began to organize, to speak openly of rebellion, to question the very foundations of the system that had kept them subjugated for centuries. The nobility, however, was not blind to this change. The rebellion in Dunwell had shaken the very core of the feudal order, and the lords were determined to crush the uprisings before they could spread further. The king, who had long turned a blind eye to the suffering of the common people, was now forced to respond. He sent out his army, commanding them to suppress the growing tide of resistance. But the peasants were not intimidated. They had tasted victory, and they were no longer willing to cower before the might of the king's army. The rebellion had become a symbol of something greater than just their own plight. It had become a symbol of hope for all those who had been oppressed, of a world where justice and equality could exist, where the common man could live without the constant fear of exploitation. As winter approached, the leaders of the rebellion, Elric, now a seasoned leader, and others who had joined the movement, gathered in secret to plan their next steps. They knew that the coming months would be crucial. The king's army was marching closer, and the time for confrontation was fast approaching. Elric had become more than just a symbol of the resistance. He had become the voice of the oppressed. His words, though simple, carried the weight of years of suffering. The peasants rallied behind him, not just because of his strength, but because he spoke to their deepest fears and desires. He understood their struggles in a way that no lord or king ever could. "I have seen what it means to work the land," Elric told his followers during one of their secret meetings. "I have seen the hours we toil, the sweat on our brows, the blood we've spilled for this land. And yet, when we fall, when we can no longer work, there is no mercy, no kindness, no understanding. They leave us to starve, to suffer, while they sit in their castles, counting their wealth." The crowd nodded in agreement, their faces hardening with resolve. "We will not be silent anymore," Elric continued. "We will not live in fear. The time has come to take back what is ours. This land is ours, and it is time we demand our share." The room erupted in applause, the sound of their unity filling the air. It was in these moments that Elric could feel the strength of their cause, the power of their collective will. The rebellion had become more than just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the very soul of the people. As the rebellion gained momentum, the king's forces began to gather, marching across the land to suppress the uprising. The peasants, armed with little more than tools and makeshift weapons, knew they were outmatched in terms of strength and resources. But they also knew that their numbers, their determination, and their cause were their greatest assets. The king's army, led by a ruthless general named Sir Geoffrey, was well trained and heavily armed. They had been tasked with quelling the rebellion quickly and decisively, and Sir Geoffrey had no intention of allowing any signs of insurrection to survive. The peasants, he believed, were nothing more than rabble who needed to be put down with an iron fist. The first skirmishes between the peasants and the king's forces were brutal. The peasants, though poorly equipped, fought with a ferocity born of desperation. They knew that if they lost this fight, their families would suffer and their homes would be destroyed. The fields they had worked for so many years would be taken from them, and they would be cast aside like cattle. In the town of Aylesbury, just a few miles from Dunwell, the peasants gathered for their first large-scale confrontation with Sir Geoffrey's army. The streets, once peaceful and full of life, were now filled with the sounds of clanging swords, the cries of battle, and the shouts of resistance. The peasants, led by Elric, had fortified the town, setting up barricades and digging trenches. They had no professional soldiers, but they had a cause that burned brighter than any weapon could. When the king's army arrived, they were met with a wall of resistance. Sir Geoffrey's soldiers, confident in their superiority, charged forward with all the force they could muster. But the peasants fought back with a tenacity that caught them off guard. They used the land to their advantage, knowing the terrain better than any soldier. They ambushed the king's forces from the trees, from the rooftops, from the alleys. The battle raged for hours, the outcome uncertain. Sir Geoffrey, growing frustrated with the unexpected resistance, ordered his men to burn the town to the ground. The smoke from the flames could be seen for miles, a signal to all that the king's forces were not to be trifled with. But the peasants would not be cowed. Even as the flames consumed their homes, they fought on. They knew that if they lost, it would be the end of their struggle. But if they won, it would be a victory not just for themselves, but for all the oppressed people of the land. At the height of the battle, when it seemed like the king's forces might finally break through, the peasants received reinforcements. A group of villagers from nearby towns had come to their aid, bringing with them food, weapons, and most importantly, more fighters. With their help, the tide of the battle began to shift. Sir Geoffrey, seeing his men being pushed back, ordered a retreat. The king's army, though better equipped and trained, was no match for the sheer willpower of the peasants. They had fought for their homes, for their families, and for their freedom. In the end, it was their unyielding spirit that won the day. The victory in Aylesbury sent shockwaves through the kingdom. The peasants had struck a decisive blow against the king's forces, and word of their success spread quickly. The rebellion, once a small spark, had grown into a full-fledged revolution. The lords and the king were no longer in control of the narrative. The people had risen, and they were not going to fall back into silence. But while the victory was significant, it did not bring peace. The rebellion had only just begun, and the road ahead would be long and fraught with danger. The king's forces would not give up easily, and neither would the lords who had been challenged by the peasants. There would be more battles, more suffering, and more sacrifice. The peasants, however, had learned a valuable lesson. They had learned that they were not powerless, that they could stand up to the forces that had kept them oppressed for so long. And with each victory, no matter how small, their confidence grew. They were no longer a scattered group of individuals, but a united force, fighting for the future of their people. As winter deepened, the rebellion continued to spread across the land. The lords and the king tried to suppress the uprisings, but the peasants were determined. They fought on, driven by a belief in their cause that could not be extinguished. They had tasted victory, and they would not let it slip away. In the spring of 1495, the rebellion reached its peak. The peasants, now organized and battle-hardened, launched a coordinated assault on the castles and strongholds of the lords. The battles were fierce, but with each passing day, the lords' grip on the land grew weaker. The peasants had shown that they were not afraid to fight for what they believed in, and in doing so, they had proven that the old order was no longer sustainable. The king, seeing the writing on the wall, finally agreed to meet with the leaders of the rebellion. The negotiations were tense, and many of the peasants feared that they would be betrayed. But in the end, the king, recognizing the growing power of the people, agreed to grant them certain concessions. The feudal system, while not abolished entirely, was reformed, and the peasants were granted more rights, more freedom, and more control over the land they worked. It was not a perfect victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The peasants had fought for their rights, and they had won. They had shown the world that the power of the people, when united, could not be easily silenced. And though their struggle was far from over, the events of the 15th century had changed the course of history forever. The land, once dominated by the lords and kings, was now a place where the voices of the people could be heard. The peasants had won their dignity, their rights, and their future. And though they would continue to face challenges, they knew that they were no longer alone. They were a part of something larger, something that would shape the future of the kingdom for generations to come. As spring blossomed into summer in 1495, the wind of change blew across the kingdom. The land, once darkened by the shadows of feudal oppression, now seemed to hum with the possibility of something new. The peasants, emboldened by their victories, had gained more than just land and rights. They had gained a voice in a world that had long ignored them. But the journey ahead was not without its dangers. Even as the victory seemed within reach, the forces that had long controlled the land were far from defeated. The rebellion had sparked something deeper, a fear that rippled through the castles and courts of the nobility. The king, still reeling from the losses his forces had suffered, called for a council. The nobles gathered at the king's court, the air thick with tension. Each lord was filled with a sense of urgency, afraid that the revolt was not just a passing storm but the beginning of a shift in power. The rebellion, which had once been dismissed as an inconvenience, had become a movement that threatened to overturn centuries of tradition. For the first time, the nobility realized that the peasants, those whom they had always looked down upon, had the power to change the course of history. The king's chief advisor, Lord Ravenshade, was the first to speak. A man known for his cunning and cold demeanor, Ravenshade was not one to take defeat lightly. He had witnessed firsthand the brutality of the rebellion and understood the necessity of regaining control. "The peasants are emboldened, Your Majesty," he said, his voice low but firm. "We cannot allow this to continue. Their insurrection has reached beyond Dunwell. It is now a movement that has spread across our lands. They believe they can challenge the power of the crown." The king, weary from years of war and dissension, nodded. His face, once flushed with the arrogance of absolute power, now bore the marks of doubt. "What do you suggest, Lord Ravenshade?" Ravenshade stood tall, his dark cloak swirling around him as he stepped forward. "We must strike decisively," he said. "We must remind the peasants who truly holds power. A few more examples of what happens when they rise against us will serve as a reminder. We will crush their spirit, break their morale. Let them know that they will never succeed." The king's eyes glinted with a dangerous mix of fear and resolve. He turned to the other lords, who were watching the exchange closely. "Prepare your armies," the king commanded. "We will put an end to this rebellion once and for all." But little did the king know, the resistance was not simply an army, it was a cause. The peasants had learned from their previous victories. They were no longer just fighting to survive, they were fighting for something far greater, the right to live freely, without the shackles of centuries of oppression. And in the heart of the rebellion, there was a leader who embodied that cause more than anyone else, Elric. Elric had become a legend. His name had spread far beyond Dunwell, beyond Aylesbury. To the peasants, he was not just a leader, but a symbol of hope, of defiance. He spoke not just with words, but with action. And it was his actions that inspired thousands to rise up against the old order. In the months that followed the victory in Aylesbury, Elric's leadership had solidified the rebellion. He was no longer just a voice in the crowd, he was its rallying point. The people followed him because they believed in him. He was one of them, a farmer, a worker, a man who had felt the lash of the lords and tasted the bitterness of injustice. He understood their pain because he had lived it. One afternoon, as Elric sat in a dimly lit hut, surrounded by his closest advisors, he received word of the king's latest plans. The message was brief but clear: the king was mobilizing his forces for a final assault. This would be their last chance to end the rebellion. Elric's eyes narrowed as he read the letter. It was a challenge to everything the rebellion stood for. "The king believes this will be the end of us," Elric said softly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "But he does not understand that this is no longer just about land or wealth. This is about our right to live without fear." His advisor, Alastair, a grizzled veteran of many battles, spoke up. "We've fought them before, Elric. We can do it again. But we'll need to strike before they have a chance to organize fully. We need to catch them off guard." Elric nodded. He knew that time was running out, and their window of opportunity was closing. The peasants could not afford another drawn-out conflict. Their numbers were still smaller than the king's army, and though they were united by a common cause, they lacked the resources and training of the royal forces. "We will not wait for them to come to us," Elric said, determination flashing in his eyes. "We will meet them head-on. But this time, we will strike at the heart of their power." The plan was simple but dangerous. Elric and his forces would march straight into the heart of the kingdom's stronghold, Eldenstone Castle. It was the seat of the king's power, the symbol of everything the rebellion had fought against. To strike there would send a message, not just to the king, but to all the lords who had supported him. As the peasants prepared for the assault, Elric stood atop a hill overlooking the battlefield. He could see the banners of the king's army gathering in the distance, their black and gold standards fluttering in the wind. His heart pounded in his chest, but he held steady. This was the moment. The outcome of this battle would determine the future of the kingdom, and perhaps the future of the entire world. With a deep breath, Elric turned to his men. "This is it," he said, his voice steady but filled with passion. "Today, we fight not just for our homes, but for the future of our children, for the future of all who have been oppressed for centuries. This is our moment. We will make it count." The peasants, though nervous, nodded. They had followed Elric through hardship and victory, and they would follow him now, into the jaws of battle. As the sun began to set, the two forces met on the field of Eldenstone. The air was thick with tension, the scent of smoke and earth mingling in the breeze. The battle that ensued was fierce, the ground beneath them turning to mud as blood soaked into the soil. The peasants fought with everything they had, their weapons crude but their spirits unyielding. They knew that this battle could be their last, but they fought with a fury that matched the size of their dreams. At the heart of the battle, Elric clashed with Sir Geoffrey, the ruthless general who had once led the king's forces against them. Their swords rang out in the air, a deadly dance of steel. Elric's strength was unmatched, but Geoffrey was no fool. He fought with all the experience of a seasoned warrior. The two men circled each other, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. In the end, it was Elric's resolve that won the day. With a powerful swing, he disarmed Geoffrey and sent him sprawling to the ground. The general, gasping for air, looked up at Elric, his eyes filled with both hatred and disbelief. "Why fight for them?" Elric asked, his voice steady as he stood over the fallen general. "What have they given you? What is worth more than the lives of your people?" Geoffrey sneered. "You are nothing but a fool, Elric. You think you can defeat the king? You think the land will be better off without us?" Elric looked down at him, his expression softening. "The land will be better off when the people are free. When they no longer have to live in fear. That is what we are fighting for." With those words, Elric raised his sword, and in a single motion, ended the life of one of the king's most feared generals. The death of Geoffrey marked the turning point of the battle. The king's forces, leaderless and disorganized, began to retreat. The peasants had won. The echoes of the battle at Eldenstone reverberated through the land. The royal army had been routed, their commanders either dead or fleeing, leaving the field of battle to the peasants. The ground was slick with mud and blood, but the air was thick with a newfound sense of triumph, a feeling that had long been absent in the hearts of the oppressed. For the first time, the peasants stood victorious, not only over the forces that had sought to suppress them, but over centuries of subjugation. Yet, even in this moment of celebration, Elric knew that this was not the end. It was only a beginning. The remnants of the royal army limped back to the capital, their pride shattered, but their resolve not yet broken. They would regroup. They would replenish their ranks. They would come again. The rebellion had not won the kingdom, it had only taken a step toward it. And Elric knew that the forces of the crown would not tolerate this insurgency for long. In the aftermath of the battle, Elric called together his closest advisors and allies. The camp was filled with the sounds of men and women tending to the wounded, preparing what little food they could scavenge, and rebuilding their strength. But the work of the rebellion was far from over. Elric, standing before his assembled generals, felt the weight of what lay ahead. "We have won a great victory today," Elric began, his voice steady despite the fatigue he felt in his bones. "But this is only the first of many battles we will face. The king will not rest until he has destroyed us. We must prepare for what comes next." The advisors nodded in agreement. Among them was Alistair, the grizzled war veteran who had fought alongside Elric since the earliest days of the rebellion. Alistair had seen many battles, but he had never seen a fight like this. The peasants were no longer the rabble they had once been. They were an organized force, unified by a common cause. But they were still outnumbered, still under-equipped. They needed more than just courage to succeed, they needed strategy, planning, and reinforcements. "We have to strike while the king is still reeling from the loss at Eldenstone," Alistair suggested. "If we wait too long, they will regroup, and will be caught off guard." Elric nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, Alistair. We can't let them have time to rebuild their forces. But we also can't be reckless. We need to strike at their heart, at the capital itself. If we can take the city, we can end this war once and for all." Taking the capital would be no small feat. The city of Eldenstone was the seat of the king's power, a fortified stronghold bristling with defenders and surrounded by miles of heavily guarded land. To approach it was to invite disaster. The peasants would have to find a way to break through the walls of not only the city but also the royal authority itself. Elric knew that the kingdom would not fall easily. But he also knew that the time for hesitation was over. Days turned into weeks as Elric and his advisors carefully plotted their next move. They gathered intelligence, scouted enemy positions, and trained their forces in the art of siege warfare. The peasants, though once humble farmers and laborers, were becoming seasoned soldiers. Their unity and resolve were their greatest strengths, and Elric began to see in them the potential for something far greater than he had ever imagined, a true army, not just of rebels, but of men and women willing to fight for their freedom. But not everyone shared Elric's vision. Among the rebel ranks, there were whispers of dissent. Some feared that the cost of taking the capital would be too great, that the rebellion had already reached its peak and that the time to negotiate for peace had come. They argued that Elric's pursuit of absolute victory was a dangerous gamble, one that could lead to ruin. But Elric would not be swayed. He had seen what happened when the peasants were ignored, when their voices went unheard. He would not stop now, not when they had come so far. The road to Eldenstone was long and fraught with peril. The peasants moved under the cover of night, keeping to the forests and the hills, avoiding the well-trodden roads that were watched by royal scouts. They were a small force, but they moved with purpose and precision. Elric, leading them, felt the weight of his decisions bearing down on him. He had once been a simple farmer, a man who lived by the seasons and the soil, but now he was something more, a symbol of resistance, of hope, and of defiance. By the time they reached the outskirts of the capital, the weather had turned. A fierce storm rolled in from the east, turning the ground into a quagmire and limiting visibility. It was both a blessing and a curse. The rain would mask their movements, but it would also make the siege more difficult. The peasants would have to work quickly if they were to have any hope of breaching the walls before the king's army could mobilize to defend the city. As Elric stood on a hill overlooking Eldenstone, his heart pounded in his chest. He could see the castle, its towering walls shrouded in mist, the fires of the royal camp flickering in the distance. He could hear the distant sounds of the city, the clanging of metal, the barking of dogs, the murmur of the crowd. It was a city of power, a city of wealth, but also a city of oppression. And it was about to be laid siege to by the very people it had once ignored. Now, Elric whispered, his voice a soft command. Now, we fight for our future. The attack began at dawn, under the cover of the storm. The peasants, armed with crude weapons and makeshift siege equipment, moved swiftly and silently toward the city walls. They had no choice but to rely on stealth, hoping that the king's forces would be caught off guard. The rain poured down in sheets, drenching them to the bone, but they pressed on, determined to succeed. The first wave of attack came from the eastern gate, where Elric's forces had positioned themselves. The city guards, ill-prepared for an assault in such weather, were slow to respond. The peasants breached the outer defenses with surprising speed, using ladders and ropes to scale the walls. The clash of steel and the shouts of battle filled the air, but Elric's forces were relentless. They pushed forward, determined to make their way to the heart of the city. The battle raged for hours. The peasants, though outnumbered, fought with the strength of men who had nothing left to lose. They fought not for glory or riches, but for their right to live freely, to reclaim the land that had been stolen from them. Elric led the charge, cutting down any who stood in his path, his sword flashing in the rain-soaked air. By midday, the rebels had gained a foothold within the city. The royal forces, stunned by the speed and ferocity of the attack, were in disarray. But the battle was far from won. The inner walls of the city remained heavily fortified, and the king's elite guard had been mobilized to protect the citadel at all costs. Elric knew that the final push would be the hardest. But he also knew that if they could take the heart of Eldenstone, they could end the rebellion once and for all. The fighting grew fiercer as the day wore on. Elric's forces, battered but unyielding, pressed forward through the streets of the city. They were met with fierce resistance, but they fought on. At every turn, the peasants faced royal soldiers, knights, and mercenaries, but they never faltered. They were united by a single purpose: to break the chains that had bound them for so long. Finally, after hours of relentless fighting, Elric and his forces reached the heart of the citadel. The royal guards, though well-trained, were no match for the fury of the peasants. The king's forces were broken. With a final surge of strength, Elric broke through the gates of the inner sanctum, standing face to face with the king's final line of defense. The citadel's halls were eerily quiet, the clashing of swords and the distant roars of battle echoing down from the courtyard. Elric's boots slapped against the cold stone floor, the sound reverberating in the tense silence. His chest heaved with exhaustion, but his resolve was unwavering. They were close now, so close to ending the kingdom's tyranny. He could feel it in the air, that electric anticipation of the final confrontation. Around him, his soldiers were weary but filled with a renewed fire. The earlier skirmishes had taken their toll on both sides, but the peasants had fought as if possessed, driven by the desperation and desire for justice that had fueled this revolt from the very beginning. Their victory at Eldenstone had been a beacon, and now, as they pressed deeper into the citadel, they knew they were no longer just rebelling, they were reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. At the center of the citadel stood the throne room, its massive double doors an imposing barrier between the rebels and the monarch who had once ruled over them with an iron fist. Elric motioned for his best soldiers to stand ready, their weapons drawn and their eyes set with unflinching determination. They would not stop until they had reached the king himself. Through the smoke and the chaos of the battle outside, the final gate to the throne room creaked open. The royal guard, the last line of defense, stood in a tight formation, armored in shining plate and bearing the insignia of the crown. They had been trained for this moment, prepared to defend their king at all costs. They were noble warriors, loyal to their monarch, but Elric could see the hesitation in their eyes. They had heard the battle cries of the peasants, seen the destruction of their comrades, and sensed the inevitable truth: the king's reign was at an end. The two forces stood across from each other in the grand hall. Elric, with his ragtag band of peasants, the embodiment of years of suffering, facing the polished steel and noble faces of the royal guard. The tension was palpable, a heavy silence hanging in the air as both sides prepared for the final confrontation. Elric raised his sword, its edge glinting faintly in the flickering torchlight. "This is it," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "The time for suffering has passed. Today, we take back what was stolen from us. Today, we reclaim our future." With that, the clash erupted. The peasants surged forward with the ferocity of a storm, their weapons clashing against the heavy armor of the royal guard. The guards fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered and outmatched by the sheer will of the peasants. Elric moved through the fray like a force of nature, cutting down any who dared stand in his path. His sword flashed with a purpose that could not be denied. In the midst of the battle, Elric caught sight of the throne. It loomed at the far end of the hall, a symbol of the power that had been used to crush the lives of countless peasants for generations. He could almost taste it: victory, revenge, and freedom. But the king was still inside, and Elric knew that the true test lay ahead. As the last of the royal guards fell, the throne room fell into a tense, eerie silence. The rebels had cleared the way to the throne, and now Elric stood before the doors to the king's chamber. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the realization that everything they had fought for, everything they had bled for, was about to culminate in this singular moment. With a deep breath, Elric kicked the doors open, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, King Oswin sat upon his gilded throne, his face a mask of arrogance and contempt. He was no longer the mighty monarch who had once ruled over the kingdom with an iron fist. His once pristine robes were torn and stained, his crown askew, and his eyes were filled with an unmistakable fear. The king had seen the fall of his kingdom coming, but he had refused to believe it would actually happen. Now, it was too late. Elric, the king sneered, his voice laced with bitterness. "You think you've won? You think this is over? You cannot defeat me. I am the king. My blood is royal. I am the law of this land." Elric stepped forward, his sword still raised, his eyes locked onto the king's. "You are nothing more than a tyrant," he said, his voice cold and steady. "You have ruled through fear, through bloodshed. You never once cared about the people of this land. You never once saw us as anything more than cattle for your endless wars and taxes. But that ends now." The king stood, his eyes flashing with anger, but the fear was undeniable. He had always known that his reign was built on a foundation of sand, and now, the tide had come to wash it all away. "You are a fool, Elric," the king spat, his voice trembling. "You do not understand the power you seek to destroy. The nobility, the crown, it is the very fabric of society. Without it, there will be chaos. You will have nothing. No future. No order." Elric's gaze never wavered. "I would rather live in chaos than live under a king who sees his people as nothing more than pawns in his game. The kingdom will change. We will rebuild it from the ground up, with fairness and equality, not with tyranny and oppression." The king's eyes widened, his mind racing for a way to salvage the situation. But it was too late. Elric had the support of the people, and the crown was slipping from his grasp. The rebellion was not just a revolt, it was the birth of a new era. A new order was coming, one where the peasants would no longer bow before their lords. With a final, decisive movement, Elric raised his sword and struck. The king's last breath left him in a gasp, and his body crumpled to the ground. The throne, that symbol of so much pain and suffering, was finally empty. Outside, the battle had subsided, and the cries of the peasants grew louder. The king's reign was over. The city of Eldenstone had fallen. The rebellion had triumphed. But even as Elric stood victorious in the heart of the citadel, he knew that the fight was far from over. The kingdom would not be rebuilt in a day, and the wounds of the past would not be healed easily. But for the first time in generations, the peasants had hope. They had shown that they were not powerless, that their voices could not be silenced. And with that hope, Elric knew that the future was theirs to shape.